All right, it's time to look into what's trending in employment law. Lawyer, you're on the clock.
Bill, we talked a little bit about the weather earlier, and you were talking about how nice it is in St. Louis. And so with the weather changing, what does that mean?
Oh, it must be political season. I think you're going
National,
to say something about hate your neighbor
yeah,
season.
National Hate Your Neighbor season. It's no secret. I'm not revealing anything new here that we are in a very, very divided country. It really does seem to be about 45% who are going to vote to the left, 45% who are going to vote for the right, and about 10% of the middle that typically will swing an election. And so, again, we are very, very polarized with about one out of every two people having different views. And it could create a lot of issues, not just in society itself, but of course that bleeds over into the workplace. So I do want to offer a couple of tips for trying to keep political conflict to a minimum as the election cycle heats up. Something that I've reminded people about certainly during the last presidential election, and have talked about this many times on the program and with you over the years. So, we want to make sure that these face-to-face interactions between employees don't turn into arguments in the workplace, bullying via social media. We want to try to keep political propaganda like shirts and buttons and other types of propaganda that might be offensive to some outside of work. And it's really hard because, of course, we ourselves in HR folks in organizations, they have their own political views as well. And so there may be a temptation to allow some expression of political support for one side or the other. And that in and of itself can be very destructive within the organization. And so it's very important that us as leaders, that we are able to sort of tamp this down, rein in our own personal feelings, and try to apply things very, I'm going to throw out the C word, very consistently across the organization. Yes, exactly. Yes. So I want to offer some tips for organizations. But before I do that, I want to talk about some stats that I pulled for the last presidential election. And my hunch is that it's going to probably be very, very similar during this election cycle. So 78% of employers report that they have employees discussing politics at work. That's almost 80% of employers.
I don't know what happened to, the way I was taught is these are just not things that you talk about at work, right? And I do find it difficult not to discuss them with people that I enjoy or trust. But it is a very different day than it was for me back in the 80s when it was like, hey, you just don't talk about these things outside of the household.
Well, and again, with the very divided electorate, and it seems that almost every issue somehow turns political these days. So 47%, and this is again going to just right back to right around the 2020 election, 47% report that of employers report that the 2020 presidential election impeded their employees' ability to get their work done. That's almost 50%. 26% say the election had a moderate or big impact on their employees' ability to do their job. 33% say they spend more time consuming political news at work than they used to. 36% reported the 2020 election led them to avoid talking to a coworker because of their political views. And 31% of employees who talk politics at work report being stressed or frustrated. So keep that in mind as we head toward this new election cycle. I mean, very important issues for regarding discourse in the workplace. So my suggestion is that we have to remember that we as an organization are made up of people across the political spectrum, and not only across the political spectrum, but even within the being right or being left or being centrist, there's nuances to everybody's position these days. And so the first thing I would strongly suggest to employers is that we as the employer need to decide the company's position and then educate management to comport their behaviors. And this again is where I suggest that we need to be leaders, and we need to try to tamp down discourse in the workplace. The goal of the workplace is not for political debate in most workplaces. The goal is to produce an excellent product or provide an excellent service. And that should be first and foremost for the business itself.
So, Burt, let me ask you a quick question to that before you move to the next topic. So just from a legal perspective here, is there anything from a position we can say, look, it's a work rule, we don't discuss that here? Or can that fall into the concerted activity side of things, depending on what you may be discussing?
Yeah, so I think there's a big difference, Phil, between somebody who wears a shirt in the workplace that says vote for Joe Biden versus somebody who wears a shirt in the workplace that says vote for Joe Biden, he's pro-union, and this company needs a union, something like that. I think
Right.
you have to be nuanced about it. If the person ties the political expression to their terms and conditions of employment, then I think that becomes a little bit more protected under the National Labor Relations Act. If it is purely just a political expression, then I think that it's not necessarily protected. We also need to be mindful of state laws in this respect. And so, the first thing for employers to do really is to decide what their position is. Is the company going to be neutral? And if it is, then the company needs to be consistent about prohibiting or sponsoring, hosting, gathering, or gatherings or fundraisers for one party or candidate, not interjecting the company into social or political issues, and eliminating political media in the workplace. I think that that's really, really important. If the company decides that it's not going to be neutral and it is going to take a stance, then they need to be prepared for backlash, not just from their own employees, but also potentially the public. We all witnessed what went on with Anheuser-Busch and Dylan Mulvaney with their social media campaign. So you just need to be careful before wading into these issues. So I do have 5 recommendations to employers. The first is to implement a policy. We do need to be mindful of state law. In this respect, most states would allow an employer to implement a policy. And keep in mind, most employers in the private sector, employees do not necessarily have First Amendment rights to free expression in the workplace. It is a private place of employment. The second step after implementing a policy is to prohibit the use of company equipment or property to create or display material to promote or oppose any political cause. Again, we don't want people using our equipment to further their stance. The third step would be to prohibit pressure on coworkers to participate in political activities. Fourth would be to prohibit external political activity if connectable to the company. In other words, people are free to do what they want outside the workplace for the most part, but they definitely should not be dragging the company into their political expression, wearing our shirts or trying to maintain that the company is taking a position on a political issue. And then finally, train on what our policy is and warn of the disciplinary consequences for violating that policy. I think those are good steps to take to try to protect everybody on both sides of the issue. Again, keep in mind that everybody in every organization is made up of people across the political spectrum. So that's what I have for you on the first one.
Well, great. We're going to close out and go right on to Deanne here, but I want to just get to the chat, and I'm seeing some congratulations and chief votes in our chat. So thank you for all of that. Dave Forsey, always happy to have him with us, and thank you. And there was a great question about, what about Let's Go Brandon shirts?
So Let's Go Brandon shirts, to me, it is an absolute political expression these days. I'm not going to cover the history of how that phrase came up. It was kind of accidental and kind of funny if you watched it, how it came to be. But Let's Go Brandon is a political phrase these days. And so again, that anybody who's wearing a Let's Go Brandon shirt, you know that they're anti-Biden. not necessarily pro-Trump, but they're anti-Biden. And I think that the employer would be wise to prohibit that type of expression in the workplace.
All right. So let's revisit and make sure our dress code policies give us the space we need to keep our workplace free from these types of aggravations and distractions that some people can take very seriously and get themselves out of sorts. Burt, I'm going to have to cut you off because you've done a great job, as always, digging deep on this one. I know you have more to share, and we'll cover those items next week.